Okay. 50 episodes, hey? Who would have thought?
Yeah. But, you know, we're critically eroding the world's supply of climate and energy reports. I've got a great big report here from Simon Michaud showing that there cannot possibly be enough reports to sustain this podcast. It's a fact that you need 2 weeks worth of backup podcasts at all times. And there just aren't enough reports to justify that kind of transition. So,
well, as it turns out, no lesser eminence than Amory Lovins says that outdated energy reports are one of the world's prime renewable resources.
Indeed.
This is Let Me Sum Up, your regular deep dive into recent reports on climate and energy. I'm Luke Menzel, recording on Wurundjeri land, and I'm joined, as always, by my 2 co-hosts. Global Vice President for promoting the Patreon at the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Frankie Muscovich. Hello, Frankie.
Good evening, Luke and Tennant. I'm here on Gadigal country tonight, and isn't it a delight to be here with you both on this very auspicious occasion? And I just, before we get into it, want to do a massive shout out to all the people who have supported us on our Patreon, which is going great. I reckon we're a little over halfway towards our target of being able to sustain an editing resource for the pod, and that wouldn't be possible without lots of you lovely folk supporting us to keep doing this. Here's hoping we get to do this for at least another 50 episodes.
Yeah. And a man who has now co-hosted 50 auspicious episodes of this podcast, but has not yet succeeded in getting us to sum up a CBAM paper, Tennant Reid. G'day, Tennant.
Every night I go to sleep weeping with that knowledge. But maybe my days of tear-stained pillows are almost at an end, for I sense there might be a CBAM-related paper coming that not only could be addressed, but must be addressed by this here podcast.
I know there's been 1 or 2 CBAM papers come across our desk over the last couple of years, Tennant, that you haven't considered worthy. I have the strong sense that you wanted your first LMSU CBAM paper to be special.
Oh, God.
Yes, there'll be candles. There'll be, if not romantic, then at least academic music. It will be a very special night of nights indeed. But that night is, in its way, not as special as this one.
That's right, because this is our 50th episode of the Let Me Sum Up podcast, and we are commemorating it with our first ever Ask Me Anything episode. The questions have come in from Summerupperers right across Australia and 1 or 2 from around the world. Thank you to everyone that lobbed in a question. We're going to try to get to as many of them as we can. Tennant, Frankie, are you ready to field some questions?
I was born ready.
All right, let's get into it. Our very first question is a process question, actually, and came in via email from friend of the pod, Dylan McConnell. He writes, how do you decide what reports to cover given the veritable fire hose of material foisted upon us on an almost daily basis? And how do you manage conflicts of interest or special interests? Tennant, you're the primary curator of what we like to call the pile. Do you want to field the first part of that question about how we choose what to sum up?
Yeah. Also, the 2 things that I think play the biggest role in that selection are, first, are we going to learn something new? Because there's a lot of angles to climate and energy, and the insufficiency of any one point of view to tell you everything you need to know or could benefit from knowing about it is like one of the reasons why we started doing this.
Yep.
And so, yeah, a new subtopic, new angle on that topic, a kind of skill or a mode of analysis that we haven't had a lot of exposure to, like that kind of stuff is gold. But then the other value is this a paper that's going to help us and our listeners with a topic that they need support on. So even if it's not super novel or new, is it just essential? And there's been a bunch of major policy statements or key regular products from Australian regulators or the bodies that prepare regular analyses of the state of the energy market or of how we're going on climate, that everybody in our world would really like more time to read than they've got. And those are pretty core business for us to focus on. It does mean sometimes that it's harder to pick the sort of obscure things that might be interesting B-sides, but we have a sacred duty to the climate and energy people of this wide brown land, Australia.
I feel like that's particularly the case over the last 6 months. We've really been very Australia focused in the last 6 months, much more so than we were in the first 18 months of the podcast. And I don't know if there's just more happening or there's like processes that have spun up, but it's just like every couple of weeks when it comes time to choose a paper, there's almost invariably a significant government report or a critical piece of analysis that is very focused on the Australian market that we sort of couldn't pass by.
Yeah. I think timeliness feels like another key criteria for us on when to choose to talk about something. And if I reflect on when we started the pod, it was around when the Albanese government was elected. And so, in those early months, there were a lot of reviews kicked into gear, processes set in motion. I think what we're seeing, particularly over the last 6 months, is a lot of that work sort of coming into fruition and some of the more detailed analyses coming out. So I do think that's been a factor in it all. I think, we all have cause to focus on demand side policy in our day jobs. That's one of the things that brings the three of us together outside of this pod. And whilst I think that's a lens that we bring to everything that we read, I've been even a little surprised that we haven't, I think, necessarily zeroed in so much on that, where perhaps the kind of professional tendency might. So I've really enjoyed getting to, I think, really sort of step outside of my lane, if I can put it that way, when it comes to doing this pod and read a little bit more broadly. That's been great. That's been a great part of it.
Of course, our particular lane in that sense is to read supply side papers and complain that they don't focus more on the demand side.
Well, somebody's got to do it, Luke.
I agree with you. It's been a real delight to have a reason and a regime which forces me to read outside of the pool of research and analysis and government consultation papers that I focus on in my day job at the Energy Efficiency Council. I have read much more broadly over the last couple of years than I ever would have otherwise, and I think that that's been really enriching for me. But it's also helped me be better at my job because I have more awareness, situational awareness about what's going on in the broader climate and energy space, which then sort of feeds back into my perspective on my own work as well.
Well, I'm not sure any of us particularly expected that to be such a beneficial byproduct of doing the pod, but I feel the same. And it's also really delightful when we happen across listeners of this podcast out there in real life who tell us the same, that it helps them to do their jobs better, which is great and sort of keeps us going. The other part of that question was around how we manage conflicts or special interests. And I think we've made a point, in the past of noting at various points that for example, we don't talk about papers that our organisations have published when it comes to our day job. So we try not to self-deal on the pod. And I think, we're obviously mindful that we do have day jobs, but also personal interest to balance. And I think we wanting to be really fearless and honest in the way we talk about the papers. And sometimes we probably try to avoid situations where we would be saying things that would fiercely contrast with the sort of view we would take with our professional hats on. But to be honest with you, I don't think there's been too many instances where I would have felt compromised in that way so far. I don't know if the two of you feel the same.
Well, after the episodes that we've done on integrated assessment models or on the Productivity Commission's climate paper, there's some Christmas card lists that we might not be on. Maybe that's fine. That's fine.
Yeah, and while it can be fun to give a paper that's not very good or a perspective that isn't very well-rounded or well thought through a bit of a kicking, like it's not something that I really relish. It's something I really struggle with this job because
you're a softie.
Well,
you need more killer instinct, Luke.
Bleeding heart.
Well, I want the papers to be good. I'm spending lots of time reading these papers, yes, and I always want to get something out of them. And I know how hard it is and how much effort gets put into writing these things often. And so my strong bias is to try and see the good things or the things that this paper's bringing to the table. But it's also, we've taken on this responsibility, I suppose, to give our fair and honest assessment of the argumentation and how it all hangs together and whether this is making the contribution that we would hope. And sometimes, you just need to tell it how you see it. And occasionally that means being quite critical about some of the papers that come across our desk. On the conflict of interest thing, I think part of it is just being really open about where we're working. And we've got the trailer of the show, which is called Premise and Priors. And the priors bit of that is where we work and what our roles are. And so our listeners understanding that in our day jobs we work for 3 industry bodies. All of them, a big part of their role is advocacy in the policy environment. The good news is it's not very hard to find out what any of our organisations' public positions on anything is.
It's true.
So, I feel like, we give that information. We're very, very transparent about all that with our listeners, and we trust them to be intelligent enough about that to factor that in when we're making our commentary about any particular matter. So we have our second question, and it's an audio question, and it comes from Super Summerupperer. Supra. Gosh.
Hi, Frankie, Luke, and Tennant. Keen to understand your take on what makes a climate paper a good read. Thanks.
I've got a thought. I like a paper, I will have a good reaction to a paper that is of digestible length, has clearly stated ideas and clearly stated context for those ideas, and good transparency on its sources and assumptions and its numbers. There's a place for compendious omni-reports and for formulaic perennials that, they're always coming out and you've got to read them. They are important, but they're really fun. I think of something like that paper on changing cost-benefit analysis to incorporate social equity as that was great. I didn't agree with everything in it, and it was a weird context of US cost-benefit analysis, but it gave us a great tour through where cost-benefit analysis has come from and ways in which it's gone wrong in the US, and this new approach of adjusting for the marginal social utility of income. Loved it. I could read 10 papers like that. So, yeah, that's me.
This may all sound very basic, but it is remarkable. I think, the number of papers that we come across that don't tend to follow a formula like this. And that's where where there's data involved, that it's, as you said, Tennant, it's easily accessible, but it's also presented in a way that supports the written analysis that comes along with it. So, it's there in a very transparent way, but there's analysis that complements why that data is there, and that when it comes to working through key issues or ideas in the paper, that recommendations or conclusions are made in line with those issues, rather than having, like a bunch of issues over here and then, potentially a bunch of conclusions over there and not many kind of lines drawn between those two things.
Connective tissue, Frankie, always helpful.
Yeah, and I have become more appreciative of that kind of structure, particularly in papers that are more of a technical nature, because I like to see the connection between the ideas and the solutions, being proposed to address issues that are raised.
Yep. I agree with all that. The only thing I'll add is I think the type of paper sort of changes what you're looking for from it. I think we've become keen students of the government consultation paper or report.
Yes.
And, I think it's fair to say we recognise that these documents are necessarily a lot more constrained because there's an element of politics involved, all kinds of sign-offs and hierarchies within bureaucracies that mean that those reports have a particular tone, but there are good ones and there are bad ones, right?
Yep.
And, you can say, well, is this paper grappling with the questions in good faith? Is it downplaying or alighting certain issues? Is it actually saying something?
Yep.
Or is it 60-odd pages of saying nothing, which happens from time to time?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. There's a few of those out there.
Yeah. So, yes, I think in whatever context, with whatever type of paper, it's all about, is this moving the conversation forward? And that's what I think we respond to.
Yep.
Get us more of those ones.
Yeah, indeed.
Yes, please.
Our next question comes from Barry Sterland.
Hey, Luke, Frankie and Tennant, congratulations on 50 episodes. What a great pod it's been. It's come just at the time Australia's moved from really broad positioning to the practical and hard work of designing detailed policy responses. And I think at times like this, it's just so important to have that sort of ballast outside of the political and policy circles to provide sort of current and informed analysis of all the proposals that have been coming into the public discussion. So congratulations, and it's just been such a lot of fun listening to you guys too. And my question to you guys is, what is the report as yet unwritten that you would love to sum up? Like, what topic would it have? What issue would it illuminate? Just sort of jump out of your role, as alien as this might be, as Summerupperers, to setting the agenda for the rest of us.
What do you reckon? What's on your wish list, Frankie?
One that I've been thinking on for a little while is around the structural change that's going to happen to the Australian budget over the next couple of decades. I think whilst it's completely understandable politics for both parties to be focusing on either the positive story behind the policies, that they're seeking to put in place. Like, there's also a reality that we get, an enormous amount of income that goes into general revenue and funds really important services and safety nets that come from, either revenue from export of commodities, and a whole bunch of other things there that are tied to, I guess, the economy that we've had over the last couple of decades, being very much based on fossil fuel and resource extraction. And I would really love to see a paper that lays out, I think, an honest assessment of what that sort of mix of revenue and outlays potentially looks like on major sort of pieces of the puzzle by 2050. And it could be, based on a couple of different scenarios, i.e., the sort of net zero and then, the sort of superpower one where we're potentially exporting, a bunch of green hydrogen based, products and things like that. So I'd love to see, in what quantities would we be needing to export certain things to match up, or meet with current revenue bases. Because, the sort of demographics of the country are changing as well. We're an ageing population. There'll be other changes to the budget over the next couple of decades that I think necessitates a really hard, honest look at how we're going to pay for it all. Because, a passion of mine is around this sort of just transition and also wanting to make sure that we're, supporting vulnerable communities in this country. And that's not just in a climate sense, but it is intrinsically linked to, a lot of social services and goods that we would want to see provided for. So I'd love to see that kind of paper.
That would be cool.
And I understand why that hasn't been written yet, but I still think it'd be a great thing to look at.
Well, the government doesn't have to write it.
I bet Treasury would love to see it too.
What about you, Tennant? Have you got something up your sleeve?
So I've got 3 quick hits. I would like to see a paper on how to partially replace agriculture with renewably powered food synthesis and what to do with the land freed up. There was a paper that looked like it was going to be that paper and was instead just like 2 pages of early loose maths.
Yeah.
I'd like to see a paper on whether climate change explains the Fermi paradox, not by extinction of all intelligent species confronted by it, but by changing the patterns of their growth away from the indefinite expansion in energy consumption kind of pattern that Fermi-type people thought was just the inevitable pathway of civilizations, and to something smaller, more beautiful, and sustainable. And, of course, I want to read Carbon Border Adjustments, the first 50 years.
I can see you writing that on your front porch, Tennant.
Everything was great when I was involved with them. These young whippersnappers have stuffed them up.
What about you, Luke?
I would love a grounded Australian-focused study on the options available for dealing with the gas network as we electrify more heating load. And I think there are so many really fascinating elements to this. Who bears the cost of writing down the regulated asset base, how you manage the reality that different parts of the economy are going to decarbonise across different time horizons. And if we're moving from ubiquitous distribution networks to localised networks based around industrial precincts, which is what some of the papers that we've read have suggested, that's great. But what are the intermediate steps between where we are now and how we get to that? I just think that in terms of energy system transition, it is both a fascinating question and a big unanswered question. It would be great for someone smart to do a deep dive on that.
That's an extension of the other one that I had on my list is a kind of clear-eyed assessment of the cost of augmentation of both the electricity grid to deal with electrification. There's a couple of different scenarios you might look at there versus the augmentation, of the gas network to do some of the things you were just talking about, Luke.
All right. I'm looking forward to some smart people out there getting started on those papers so we can sum them up in 12 or 18 months.
Yes, please.
Next up is OG Summerupperer Anna Hancock with a question specifically for you, Frankie.
So what does the LMSU Director of Marketing say about the sponsorship of MasterChef by Australian Gas Networks, which is supplying bottled biomethane and grey hydrogen for demonstration cooking, marketed as renewable gas?
Well, I mean, it's genius marketing and probably in the grand tradition of that industry that, has, I think the best thing they ever did was coin the phrase natural gas because it makes it sound like something, I don't know, warm and cozy and not a fossil fuel, potentially. And you can trace back the kinds of ad campaigns that industry's funded over many years. Dancing blue flame ladies on your stove, paying influencers to spruik the use of fossil gas cooking. So I think this is very much in that tradition. I do think it's not right to claim that this is renewable hydrogen. I did a little reading about it, and I think there's been some referrals to the ACCC about the use of that language, because apparently the hydrogen provided for the show is grey hydrogen, so it's made with steam methane reforming, and they're purchasing carbon credits to offset the emissions. Yeah.
They're not even trying.
No. And then I think that's the stuff that apparently, because they take barbecues off site and they do things outside of the normal kitchen. So that's what they were doing there. And then in the kitchens, they're using bottled biomethane.
Right.
My issue with this is if someone, a regular person watching MasterChef goes, wow, great, renewable gas, let me call my provider and sign up to that tomorrow. Like, they can't, because those products are not available on the retail market. So, this is basically a stalking horse for prolonging the use of fossil gas in distribution networks owned by, the body doing the sponsorship, because the reality is it's going to take a long, long time for any kind of renewable hydrogen to get up to the scale you would need. And then there's the question of whether the infrastructure can take it. As a huge, huge question on whether this would ever be cost competitive. And I think, there's no credible study suggesting that hydrogen has a future in households. Refer meta study of our friend Jan Rosenau, because it's just cheaper already to do all of that with all electric heat pumps for heating hot water and induction cooktops. So it's smart, and I'm pretty cynical about why they've done it.
I wonder if Anna is shocked about anything that you just said. It's just like,
no, I think
bowling it up.
Yeah, well,
knocked out of the park.
Yeah, I think it's a bit of a shame though that MasterChef didn't do a little bit more homework on the direction of travel, out here. And apparently some of the other MasterChef franchises in the UK, I think Italy, Denmark and Spain have all switched to induction cooktops. So wouldn't it be nice if the Australian MasterChef joined the club?
All right. Our next question came in via email from Nicholas Howarth, and he writes, if you could pick one efficiency policy implemented in Australia that had an impact and can be replicated in other countries, what would you choose? It's got to be Neighbours.
Yes.
Right? Cue the theme music.
Neighbours. Everybody
no, not that
needs
Neighbours.
good neighbours.
I'm so glad it's you singing this episode, Frankie.
Yeah.
The National Australian Built Environment Rating System and the associated commercial building disclosure program. It's that Neighbours, not the other Neighbours. It's a rating for operational performance in commercial buildings in Australia. It is required for office buildings above 1,000 square metres to disclose your Neighbours rating at point of sale or lease. And that regime has been in place for over a decade, and it's driven remarkable improvements in the energy efficiency of buildings that are required to disclose those ratings. Last time I checked, a 42% improvement in efficiency over a bit over a decade, which is world leading and remarkable. And when, Frankie, we tell our friends overseas about this, they get very excited. There's a number of countries that are either actively exploring using Neighbours or indeed using Neighbours. It exists in the UK and New Zealand. And then after they've gotten over their excitement, their next question is, well, why haven't you expanded it beyond office buildings?
Well.
Why indeed?
Yeah, I think it's I think the combination of Neighbours being the credible kind of robust benchmark and then the policy that requires disclosure have worked in a really complementary way. And of course, we would like to see the commercial building disclosure program expanded. And it's sort of the no-brainer, if you like, of policy improvements on the energy efficiency side of things for buildings. But the thing that I would just shout out, because there are countries or, regions like the EU that have very ambitious policy settings and have done for, I think, longer than Australia. So, why is it the case that we've got this amazing kind of bit of world leadership, not hiding away here because we are exporting this knowledge, but I think it's just sort of worth noting that we've had this, data-driven approach to to validating real performance using energy billing. And in a lot of other places around the world, that's still sort of been stuck on predictive modelling for new buildings without this kind of way of, verifying real-world performance. So they often talk about things like a performance gap. We might model the performance of building, then wonder why it's always 20 or 30% more. We've removed that in Australia. We've got a very good sense of how you design a building to meet the performance you expect to achieve. So it is kind of world-leading policy, and I'd love to see neighbours in more countries.
Indeed. All right. We have another one of our OG Summerupperers up next, and he has something he wants to get off his chest.
Erwin Jackson here. Congratulations to the Let Me Sum Up team for your 50th episode. My favourite podcast with the singing, the jokes, and excellent critical analysis, and still waiting for my T-shirt in the mail. My challenge to you all, really, or it's a particular challenge to Tennant, I'd really love to hear him either do a 10-minute segment. He can sing it if he likes, but talking would be fine, on the benefits of integrated assessment models, knowing that they have problems, but as he knows, I also think they have uses. So my challenge to him is to give us 10 minutes on how integrated assessment models can be used in a useful way. Love to you all, great show, and looking forward to more episodes.
Well, look, this is sheer trolling of the first order. Erwin knows what I think on this subject, and he's trying to get me to say the exact opposite. How can integrated assessment models be used in a useful way? I thought about responding in kind by saying things like, does Erwin have a wobbly table? He could stick an integrated assessment model under it. Do you have a fighter jet that's run out of missile confusing chaff? Maybe it ejects an integrated assessment model outputs out the back of it. Have you become fixated on the Devil's Tower in Wyoming after a brush with alien spacecraft? Maybe you could use integrated assessment model reports in your obsessive papier-mâché constructs afterwards. I concluded that would be churlish. I then tried assigning ChatGPT to adapt MC Hammer's "you can't touch this" as "you can't price this," but it told me to stop, recalibrate and listen, which, while clever, is from another song entirely. So then I wrote my own version, which might be available as Boko at some point. I will concede that it is useful to think about the interplay between physical systems and economic systems, which is a connection that goes both ways. It's useful to think in a structured way through our assumptions and theories about how these systems interrelate. And it is useful to get a broad sense of which factors are big and which factors are small. Those are things that potentially integrated assessment models can contribute towards. But We just need to be incredibly cautious about these models because they relentlessly try to trick us into thinking they can tell us more than they actually can. Like, it's so tempting to look at the outputs and go, we don't need to worry about this or that, or, it turns out that implementation costs are going to be significant for emissions reductions forevermore, or whatever else. The models are really limited tools, and those limitations need to be kept in mind at all times. I think the best analogy for integrated assessment models is the Palantirs in The Lord of the Rings, which bring wise men, noble men, to ruin because those seemingly wise men cannot see the limits of the tool or who it really serves.
The IEM is a dangerous tool, Erwin.
I like that was your explanation on the benefits of IAMs.
I may not be getting the endorsement contract with the IAM Marketing League of Australia just yet.
So, yes, I mean, as has been canvassed at length on multiple episodes, I agree with you, Tennant. I think if I was to speak on Erwin's behalf, he feels that the presence of IAMs has actually been helpful and a useful input into sort of engaging with the financial community, right? I guess the question is, have they done more good than harm or harm than good over the journey? And I think that's fundamentally where your disagreement with Erwin is, right?
I think they're a tempting tool because people are taken in by them. And I guess people can be taken in for good as well as for evil, but everybody should feel dirty in the process.
Okay. I think we could never have expected that debate to be resolved today. But that was enjoyable. I'm looking forward to that bit of Boko, Tennant. All right. We have an interesting question from Summerupperer, Dennis Venning.
In line with the recent Michael Liebreich article, what are your personal horsemen and superheroes of the net zero transition?
So Dennis is referring to a pair of articles that Michael Liebreich wrote recently. The first one gave 5 reasons achieving net zero will be really hard. They are the horsemen. And the second one gave 5 reasons achieving net zero will be much easier than is often suggested. They are the superheroes in this taxonomy. What do you reckon? Shall we each do a horseman and a superhero?
Yeah.
Sure.
I'll go a horseman.
Okay.
And mine is implementation time. Like the time it takes, having decided to do a particular policy, to actually translate that into something that affects anything in the real world. And it's longer than all of us like to think. You can work on compressing that time, but it takes a lot of doing. And I think implementation time should be on the minds of everybody, including people who do advocacy around demanding new actions sooner in order to try and move the Overton window of debate, because that's all very well, but really, how are you going to translate whatever into concrete action within 2 years or more of the decision? It takes a lot of doing.
So you're talking about the deployment bit of this.
Well, not even just deployment, but look at the New South Wales electricity infrastructure roadmap. Big set of announcements, big directions, legislation, very warmly received by a lot of people, and a very good set of directions a few years ago. But setting up the bodies involved in that, establishing the processes and the reports into the concrete needs, establishing contract designs, getting auctions underway, all of those things took a lot of time. We are still in the process of setting up the first renewable energy zone before any construction even begins. So it is hard work to get something from the announceable to the implementable.
Yes, and my horseman is related, which is just people, and it's the fundamental inertia
That was mine.
of societies. Have you got that?
Yeah.
Yes.
Same. Social license. Yeah.
People are the worst.
People.
Well, yeah, so...
I don't really think that. Don't worry, people. I'm on your side.
The speed at which we need to transform our society and economy is so great. And in my more pessimistic moments, I wonder if it's achievable, particularly in democratic societies, where the enthusiasm for grappling with the climate crisis is at very different levels at different parts of the political spectrum. So how you achieve that sense of common purpose that one needs to actually even create the enabling environment for the sort of the institutional and economic and deployment challenges that you're talking about, Tennant. Like that's the thing that kind of keeps me up at night.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. The only other comment I would make to support that, the need to be bringing people on a journey is consistency of message over a long period of time. And I think, particularly in Australia, we've lacked that in recent times. I think where you then come across, policy conundrums where we absolutely do need to be moving faster. If we'd have been having this kind of honest conversation and telegraphing directions of travel a decade ago, it might be a bit easier than we're finding it at the moment. So that's on governments, but it's also on advocates, as you suggest.
If only we had a time machine. Oh, we'll get to that later in the episode.
Yes.
Frankie, do you have a superhero?
I do. My superhero is the hope that the circular economy becomes a thing that is very much entrenched in the sort of systems design of everything. Right now, there's a series of market failures, which mean that the signals for people constructing stuff, building stuff, are biased towards digging stuff up out of the ground, resources, to make into products to then construct buildings, infrastructure, renewable energy, equipment. And if the signals were arranged differently, we would see a greater proportion of reuse of the materials that are already in use. So reuse, repurposing, recycling, and that would suggest to me that, the sort of forecasts over the amount of materials or critical minerals or whatever it is that we need to do this transition might be over-predicted, because if we were making better use of the materials that we've already got, or the infrastructure or the buildings, whatever it is, then that task of transition should be easier. So it's a huge, monumental kind of effort to really sort of shift a society's thinking around this. But there's an important role for policy making to encourage efficiency of materials use, preservation of existing structures over demolition and, doing things from scratch. So I think that's a huge endeavour. But if we get that right, I think it makes the transition easier.
Tennant, do you have a superhero?
My superhero is the mighty forecast error. I think that time and again in the past we have seen that forecasts of how hard it was going to be to meet previous emissions targets have turned out to be wildly pessimistic for a bunch of reasons. Some of those reasons have been they haven't really been fixed in the updated projections, but the projections have been updated. The projections tend to, like integrated assessment models, not deal with innovation terribly well at all. And to generally have a status quo bias and an assumption that the future resembles the past in all kinds of ways, including the energy intensity of GDP. And so I do think that we are going to find that some aspects of the transition are easier than we thought, even while we are struggling with implementation time on so many things, because some of what looks like locked-in future emissions actually won't turn out to be. It's not to say we should go have a nap, but I think that forecast error is largely going to be to our benefit.
Looking forward to hitting the community chest and going, bank error in your favour.
Yeah.
Reduce global warming by 0.5 degrees.
I think that's what did happen with the government's LULUCF projections. Although feelings about that differ within the climate community, I understand.
Having expressed some pessimism about inertia in society, my superhero, I'm going to say, is the adaptability of society. And one of my abiding memories of 2020 and 2021 and of all of that wreckage, I did draw some inspiration from the capacity of societies around the world to rapidly shift and self-organise around new and compelling facts on the ground. And that actually made me more hopeful about our ability to respond to climate change if we reach a threshold and make that collective decision that that's what we want to do. I suppose that just leaves us with the question of what the inciting incident for a COVID-level response would be. But luckily that wasn't one of the questions we were posed in our AMA. But we do have another good question from a friend of the podcast.
Hello, Summerupperers. Long-time listener, first-time mailbagger. My name is Mark Spencer, but I know you three already know that, as I'm the guy that occasionally has the great pleasure of doing some editing for you guys. But I'm relatively new in my second year in the energy industry, and I wanted to ask you guys one of those, far-reaching, kind of silly questions that I just love hearing on a mailbag episode. And that's the queen or king or emperor or empress for a day question. So if the three of you were emperor for the day and you had to choose one other country in the world to import the policies and regulatory environments and cultural approach to energy to Australia, what country would that be?
Do either of you have a country you're hoping will invade Australia and take over our climate and energy policy?
Well, geez.
That's the strong implication of this question.
But then somehow we take over them. Look, an obvious answer, even though it's deeply problematic, is China. On the basis that they have this mystique, and to a significant extent, reality of just being able to get stuff built, and lots of it. And there's an aspect of that clearly we would not on any account want to replicate in this country, which is the way in which public opinion basically doesn't matter and people can be figuratively or literally crushed on the whim of the government. Don't want that. What I'm thinking of is the way in which all the arms of government on many subjects related to development and construction and making stuff happen, they work together rather than at cross purposes. You have on the matter of getting things built, national government, local officials, the finance system, everybody wants a thing to happen. And
kind of don't have a choice there, do they, though?
Yeah, but not everything's the Three Gorges Dam. They've got an incredible amount of construction done, some of it on projects that actually weren't a good idea, but the ability to make things happen is something that we should feel, it is possible to build a massive proliferation of metro systems and intercity rail systems and continent-spanning HVDC cables and whatever else, it is possible to build those things. And some of those drivers cannot be replicated in a democratic society, and we should not try. But I think we should aspire to work a lot faster in decision making and implementation than we actually achieve these days in Australia and many other Western countries.
Well, I just think the human rights questions over how that happens are just maybe just a little too large for me to look past there. I'm just going to leave that there. If I were monarch for a day, I think the country I'm attracted to the most is Germany. Because, well, a couple of reasons. From a kind of machinery of government perspective, I really like that the equivalent of their Treasury and Climate Change Department are the same thing. So it's one department that does both of those things. And I think where you are forced to align economic imperatives of a government with the need to do ambitious climate action, more things happen. And that's certainly been the case there. I also like the approach they've taken to specifying sectoral targets and tying in to the level of detail of tying individual programs and policies, to solid outcomes and kind of tracking that over time. So there's real accountability built into the way that they're approaching a lot of their climate policy. And the other positive thing I would say is that I think they've been a very constructive actor on the global stage. I think a lot of the ambition in the EU is underpinned with ambition from Germany. And I really like the approach they take to knowledge sharing with other countries. I also think, looking back in time, they've been pretty critical, say in the early days, to getting real money behind the rollout of renewables, even if they weren't the ultimate winners in the race to be manufacturing those at lowest cost. That's definitely gone to China over time, but they've put dollars on the table, and there's not a kind of social argument around the imperative to do that. And just from having a small amount of insight into some of their policy-making progress on the energy efficiency side of things, they put decent amounts of dollars behind programs, and they're not so stringent as to require, very detailed cost-benefit analyses. There's a little bit more of a kind of entrepreneurial approach to the way they will try things. I like that. I don't have a drawback. I guess I haven't lived there enough to see things spectacularly fail, but I'm sure amongst the two of you, you'd have an example or two.
They've had some bumps along the road over in Germany.
They have. Yeah.
However, I will shine a spotlight on a little country that I've been learning a bit about as we've been looking in my day job for examples of really good implementation of particularly residential efficiency and electrification policy, and that's Ireland. The Sustainable Energy Authority of Ireland did a great job implementing mandatory disclosure of energy performance of homes back in 2006, and they've done a fantastic job administering some really effective grants programs for upgrades, but also rolling up their sleeves and working with trades to make sure they've got the right skills. And some of their recent hits have included being given 10 billion euros for household energy upgrades in a country the size of Victoria. And they've started accrediting one-stop shops that will support households to go from a energy assessment right through to a completed deep retrofit of their home. It's all very impressive. It didn't happen overnight. They've been on the journey for well over 20 years. But as a reference point for a very effective, steady pursuit of demand-side policy that are making a real difference in people's lives, I reckon Ireland is a pretty good template.
All right. Well, we've all auditioned for Quisling Despot on behalf of the invading Irish or German or Chinese policy export regime. Let's see who's first up against the wall when the revolution comes.
Maybe we can get China to do our renewables rollout. We can get Germany to do the solar sunshot.
This time they'll get it right.
And we can get Ireland to run the efficiency policy. All right. I'm excited about this one. Our next question comes from fan favourite, alternate co-host of the Let Me Sum Up podcast, Alison Reef.
Hello, Frankie, Tennant and Luke. My question for you guys on this occasion of your 50th episode is this. If I gave you a time machine and you could travel back in time to kill one person and prevent the climate crisis, noting that this might affect the present and might even mean you aren't even born, when would you choose to go to and who would you kill? Congratulations on making it to 50 episodes and really looking forward to hearing all the future ones.
There you go. There's a hospital pass from Reef.
Well, so I think we have to preface this by saying that this podcast does not endorse murder as a tool of public policy, with or without the aid of a time machine.
Yes. Even associated with wacky time travel hijinks.
Yeah.
Murder is wrong.
And I don't recall a specific Grattan Institute paper on that point, but I'm sure they must agree. But I think clearly the most obvious answer is like James Watt, isn't it? A dramatic improver in 1776 of the efficiency of the steam engine with the addition of a separate condenser, kicked off the Industrial Revolution. No Industrial Revolution, not much climate change. You've got a bit of deforestation. That seems like an obvious, one person. My questions to you two would be, well, would that actually work, or would the Industrial Revolution have happened anyway? But more importantly, would that be worth it? I don't think that trade-off would be worth making.
Yeah.
I don't think so either. So I went back through that sort of history of, Thomas Newcomen inventing the steam engine in the first place. Or do we kill him off? I don't think you make that trade-off for the development of the human species and all the good things that have come with that. And just quick sidebar, I went back to the Middle Ages and read that King Edward I tried to ban coal in around the late 1200s or early 1300s because of the smog in the city from coal being too much. They were burning sea coal, stuff that was washing up on the beaches. Anyway, it was the opposite of killing off someone. I feel like that's the earliest example of an environmental law. So sidebar over, but I thought that was fascinating. So I found myself then thinking about who's been responsible for the delay, the kind of muddying of the waters in terms of where the scientific consensus on all of this has been, and then the sort of corresponding inertia of getting on with the transition. So I don't know the name of who this person would be, but I sort of went down this tack of potentially it was the sort of chairman of ExxonMobil who was funding the Petroleum Institute, think tanks that were creating doubt around the science of climate change in the sort of 1950s and onwards. And I don't know if you offer one chairman that there wouldn't have been 10 shadowy, fossil fuel executives to replace them. But I do think there's in the context of this exercise, it's worth noting that the sort of fossil fuel industry centred out of the US had a lot to do with the sort of creating an environment of doubt over the scientific consensus, which was achieved very early.
All right, Menzel, who's at the top of your death list?
I agree. Like the whole premise of the question is faulty. Like, it's effectively asking us who is the Hitler of climate change.
Yep.
I don't think there is a Hitler of climate change. There is no one person you could eliminate for a bit of time hopping homicide.
Yeah. Maybe that Fermi paradox paper I commissioned earlier will explain to us that we can't prevail.
You know, as you've both noted, like the amount of good that the Industrial Revolution and ultimately sustained economic growth over centuries, which has been underpinned by fossil fuels, but has also lifted billions of people out of poverty and misery. I mean, given that context, you'd have to be pretty careful with your time travel shenanigans to ensure you weren't falling into a moral black hole by preventing all that development from taking place.
Yes.
But I think you could do some good with your time machine. And what I would do is not go back and kill people. I'd be using it to seed all the technologies that are becoming ubiquitous today. Modern solar panels, lithium-ion batteries, drop all that know-how into MIT in 1968 and let the good times roll. I'm seeing a for all mankind style scenario where a bunch of really important technological innovations happen decades earlier than they do in our timeline, and actually just price fossil fuels out of the market exactly when we need them to.
Yeah. Maybe give some of that stuff to Napoleon so that the French can compete with the coal-powered British Empire.
Yeah.
In the early years, they could get a start with I think there actually was an effort at French solar-based industrialisation in the 19th century with extremely archaic technology. Incredible. No murders after all.
We have one more question, and it is, would you believe it, another time travel question from Emily Skihill.
We all love the time travel genre. Back to the Future, Time Traveler's Wife, even A Christmas Carol. If you could go back in time to a step change moment in your early career, what would that moment be? Would you give your younger self encouragement? Would you give them advice? What would that be? Would you give a warning even? What would you ask to do differently?
A moment of reflection to close out this AMA. Frankie and Tennant, what have you got?
Well, I got my start in the workforce as an engineer doing consulting work, and I was doing like pretty technical kind of roles. I had this interest in policy and advocacy. It was like an exciting time to be working in Sydney. There was a sort of, Kevin 07 campaign. The campaign around carbon pricing was sort of happening as well. And I think at that point wanted to change tack. But I was told, I should, I'd probably have to stay in my lane as a technical expert. And expressed an interest in doing some sort of policy and advocacy work, and I was told I wouldn't be able to do that. And I wish I'd pushed back a little bit stronger on that, or found a way of job shadowing or getting myself an opportunity to do a little bit of that work earlier. Then I think I would have sort of found myself onto my current path a little sooner, because I love the work that I do as a policy wonk advocate. And I wish I'd told myself at that point to push a little harder, because it'd be worth it. And I think on a related point, I've never regretted speaking out kind of strongly on an issue or been kind of bolder than I thought maybe I should be. Do I ever regret pushing a little harder? No, I don't. So I think I'd be telling myself back then, to do that, to use your voice and to advocate with conviction.
What about you, Tennant?
What I would do is go back in my time machine to find myself in the year 2009 and tell myself to take a particular report a little more seriously. And this was the report that Frontier Economics did for Malcolm Turnbull and Nick Xenophon about the virtues of an intensity-based emissions trading scheme over the then proposed carbon pollution reduction scheme, vanilla emissions trading scheme. And at the time, I was a very junior, new wet behind the ears whippersnapper at AI Group. And there were negotiations going on between the federal government and the federal opposition towards trying to do a deal on the CPRS. That report offered a substantially different approach to the ETS that was then proposed. Coalition had a little go at negotiating towards that. They didn't get a lot of support from anybody else, and the government wasn't interested in a fundamental change in its model. So they negotiated a few other changes. A deal was presented to the coalition party room. And that party room meeting was stunned by the former chief negotiator, Andrew Robb, saying, no, didn't get enough, not good enough, shouldn't pass it. And the rest is history. The deal did not receive sufficient backing for Turnbull's brazening it out to survive. He lost the leadership in a spill by 1 vote. And 15 years later, we have a safeguard mechanism that is not a million miles away from its original DNA in that Frontier Economics report. So maybe if somebody had gone, oh, no, wait, we should take this thing more seriously. Actually, this might be pretty functional, pretty okay. Maybe there could have been enough pressure on the government of the day to make more substantial concessions that would have appealed to the sense of I did something of Andrew Robb and all the dominoes fall and we haven't wasted 15 years. Failing that, I would have stuck around with my time machine and tried to track down Andrew Robb the night before the party room meeting and got him so outrageously drunk that not even Parliament would have him, and see what happened next. I don't know. Is that like personal growth and insight? Probably not.
Might fit into the previous question.
Yeah, that's true.
I harbour no ill will to the physical safety and security of Andrew Robb.
What about you, Luke?
I've been thinking while you've both been talking. I had a few ideas, but I think what I'm going to go with is I had the opportunity to take on the role of CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council probably a little bit before I was ready for it, and it was started as an acting position, and ultimately I was already in the EC. Ultimately, the board decided to appoint me. They thought that I'd make a good fist of it. But I was definitely learning by doing. And in those early years, just the whole thing of being in the public domain, in the public debate, I was kind of nervous about that. Really wanted to be prepared, really wanted to be across my brief, was really worried about people thinking I was uninformed or didn't know obvious things, or worried that I would say something dumb. Those are all entirely reasonable and normal emotions to feel. But I've learnt that I do know stuff, but more importantly, that I don't need to project a aura of gravitas or authority through, perfect pronouncements. I used to sort of try and emulate this kind of, there's a model of a CEO which sort of like is a voice of God. Like they're just making pronouncements from the mount. They step up to the lectern, they say their piece, and then they go away from the lectern and everybody strokes their chin and goes, yes. We all know them.
Yes.
And I realised that I didn't have to be that sort of leader. I could be myself. And there has been a variety of ways that I've learnt that, but in all of my work advocating for my industry and representing my organisation, and ultimately just being a person that expresses himself in public debates, is that the more that I bring myself into the conversation, the more effective I am as a communicator, and the easier it is for people to connect with the ideas that I'm passionate about. And so I suppose if I was to go back to that, kind of stressful time, exciting time, but stressful time in my professional career, that would be the advice that I would give myself, to just relax and be myself more. I'm also very confident that I would ignore that advice. I don't think I would have been able to take it in.
Luke, you should, if you get the opportunity to go back in time, deliver that advice with the supreme authority of the CEO speaking from the mount.
Yes.
And you'll believe yourself.
That's true.
That is true. That is true. That was the delivery model that I valued at that time. But just to round out the story, this podcast is kind of the culmination or a significant step in that journey, because in this context, I feel like I'm making myself very vulnerable, because I'm just talking extemporaneously about all kinds of things in areas in which I don't have deep expertise. I think, I read the reports and I have views about the reports, but this is not like, and it's never my final opinion for all time about the topic at hand. Yeah. It is what I reckon when I'm chatting to a couple of mates after reading something interesting. Like, that's the whole premise of the podcast. So when I think about that journey that I went, like, just ridiculously over-prepared and buttoned down to just talking shit on a podcast, it's been quite a journey. But here we are. So, that's what occurs to me in terms of what I would share with poor old 2015 Luke.
I think that's terrific.
Yeah.
All right. That is our show for today. Frankie, Tennant, there are questions we didn't get to. Some really great questions, actually. There was, what is our collective meet cute? There's a question about whether we think we will collectively keep global warming to under 2 degrees. And what is in our wish list for the 6 sectoral pathways, or which 6 authors of Let Me Sum Up papers would we invite to dinner?
Tempting to answer all those now.
It would be.
But we're not going to.
We're not going to. But our listeners should not fear, because our answers to all those questions and more will be the subject of this week's bonus episode. And access to that, Frankie, is available via which website?
You should head right on over to patreon.com/LetMeSumUp and level up to become a super Summerupperer, and you can get access to all of the glorious boko that awaits, including answers to questions that at this moment remain unanswered but will be shortly, as well as whatever Tennant cooked up by way of response to Owen's earlier question.
And Tennant, we're 50 episodes down, but there are an infinite number of reports that need to be summed up out there. How can our listeners help us find out about them?
They can bring them to our attention by sending their hot tips on awesome reports to mailbag@letmesumup.net. Or they can browse through the reports we've already done at letmesumup.net, make sure the one they're suggesting hasn't already been covered, and then email their suggestion to mailbag@letmesumup.net.
That was very thorough, thank you. For Frankie Muscovich and Tennant Reid, I'm Luke Menzel. Thanks for all the support over the last couple of years, and we will talk to you again soon.